Anthony Joshua, one of the biggest stars in heavyweight boxing, one of the best boxers Britain has produced, and someone who brought life to a previously dark heavyweight division. He's a mainstream household name in the UK, but there is some controversy about his resume. Tribalism between his fanbase and the Fury fanbase have led to a lot of bickering about Joshua's record and how good it actually is. So to come up with a more conclusive answer, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through every single opponent on Joshua's record to the present day and giving them a score by placing them in the criteria, which will be determined by the opponent's wins, losses, the stage of their careers, their accomplishments and any circumstances surrounding the fight. Joshua turned professional after winning a gold medal in the 2012 Olympics and immediately signed over to Matchroom, where he's still promoted today. As I usually do in these videos, I'm going to skip through most of Joshua's first opponents. In Joshua's case, his first 8 opponents will be automatically sorted into the D tier, so he gets no points. The first win I'm going to give points for is Denis Bakhtov. Bakhtov was 8-0 at the time, and when he did step up to a certain level of opposition, he did lose. But he was competitive in some instances, like before getting injured versus Mahmoud Shah, winning a couple rounds versus Alexander Ustinov, beating Danny Williams. Obviously he wasn't a great opponent, but he wasn't a journeyman, and in which case he's going to go in the C tier, so Joshua gets 1 point. Joshua then took on 3 D-tier opponents in a row, Michael Sprott, Jason Gavin and Rafael Zumbano, before eventually taking on Kevin Johnson. Johnson is known for losing to every single good opponent he faces, but the key theme is he does go the distance every single time, it seems. Whether it's versus Vitaly Klitschko, Tyson Fury, Derek Chisora, Mahmoud Shah, Kubrat Pulev, Andy Ruiz, Daniel Dubois, Filip Hrgovic, Ajit Kabayel, Johnson did go the distance with all those guys, and Joshua finished him in 2 rounds, which I think does show how dominant Joshua was on his way up. However, I can't give extra points for the manner he beat Johnson, so it's going to have to remain as a C tier win. Then Joshua takes on Gary Cornish. At this point, this was considered the hardest test of Joshua's career, simply because Gary Cornish was 21-0 at the time. But of those 21 wins, I can't really point to anything impressive. So Gary Cornish is going to remain as a C tier win, as he would be stopped in the very first round. Then Joshua takes on his first name with some serious merit, Dillian Whyte. Now, if we were purely judging from where Dillian Whyte was at that stage of his career in 2015, he wouldn't be very high. His last win was Brian Minto, before that was Irinu Beato Costa Jr. But the idea behind this fight was to put 2 of the best heavyweight talents in Britain at the moment against each other. The run that Dillian Whyte went on after this fight was great. He then goes on to beat Dave Allen, Derek Chisora twice, Robert Helenius, Lucas Brown, Joseph Parker, Oscar Rivas, Mariusz Wrak. Dillian Whyte was a top 5 heavyweight for a long period of time. He never actually won a title, but he was on the verge of it for a very long time. The most impressive win still being Joseph Parker. Despite Dillian never becoming champion, I do think he was a championship level fighter, and for that reason he's going to go in the A tier. Obviously the best win so far, where Joshua will get 4 points. Then Joshua fights for his first ever world title versus Charles Martin. There wasn't really anything that stood out on Martin's record prior to winning the title. He got a vacant title shot versus Vladislav Guaskov, which was only a vacant title fight because Tyson Fury retired. Guaskov was winning the fight but ended up blowing out his leg in the 3rd round, and because he couldn't continue, by default Martin was declared the winner by TKO, which made him the champion in quite strange circumstances. Joshua would blow him out inside 2 rounds, and quite easily became the new IBF heavyweight champion. There really isn't much to talk about on Martin's record. He went on to lose to Adam Kownacki by close decision, then beat Gerald Washington, then lost to Luis Ortiz, then lost to Jared Anderson, but he did hurt Anderson in the final round. Really, his only good win is Gerald Washington, and he's not very good either. But to be generous, Martin is a dangerous puncher. He's got 30 wins and 27 knockouts. The Kownacki loss was a war back and forth. He dropped Luis Ortiz twice before being stopped by him. I think I can justify a B tier ranking. He's not quite world level, but not regional either. Then Joshua takes on Dominic Breazeale for his first title defence. Similar to Martin, there's not much I can talk about on Breazeale's record. The only win I can really point towards is Eric Molina, and that's about it. Joshua would take his time in this fight and eventually break down and stop Breazeale in the 7th round. There wasn't really anything that warranted Breazeale getting this fight in the first place, besides him being undefeated, so for that reason I'm going to put him in the C tier. Then Joshua takes on the aforementioned Eric Molina. Molina at this point was best known for a somewhat competitive effort versus Deontay Wilder, before he ultimately got stopped. That is about it though, I'm going to put him in the C tier. Then ultimately Joshua takes a massive step up in the form of Wladimir Klitschko. I don't really need to introduce Wladimir Klitschko as an opponent, but I will anyway. Wladimir is the 2nd longest reigning heavyweight champion in history. He took some harsh losses at the start of his career versus guys like Lamont Brewster and Corey Sanders, but he did develop, and from the period of time between 2004 all the way to 2015, he was unbeatable. From that point on, he won 22 fights in a row, winning the title back versus Chris Bird, then defending it versus the likes of Tony Thompson, Hasim Rahman, Ruslan Chagayev, Samuel Peter, David Hay, Tony Thompson, Alexander Povetkin, Kubrat Pulev. It was considered a weak division at the time, which is true, but to dominate any division for 11 years is very impressive. And it's not like he beat nobodies during that time either. He beat Chagayev, Pulev, Povetkin, David Hay especially. Then he famously lost his belts to Tyson Fury in 2015. And Joshua was Klitschko's first fight back after losing the belts. It was essentially a make or break fight for Klitschko, either retire as champion or retire as a loser. They would ultimately go back and forth in an 11-round war, both fighters hitting the canvas, and eventually Joshua won by knockout in the 11th round. Now, in the context of Tyson Fury beating Klitschko when he was champion, in Klitschko's home turf no less, that is basically as good as it gets, and that would be an S-tier win. The question is, where do you rank Klitschko as a win for Joshua? Because this was the final fight that Klitschko ever took. I'm not sure about S-tier because he was literally about to retire and he was coming off a loss, but I think he showed a lot more life in that Joshua fight than he ever did versus Fury. The way Klitschko fought in that fight is why I can't put him down too much. I can imagine that version of Klitschko chinning 99% of heavyweights. You can't tell me that version of Klitschko does not chin Dillian Whyte, so I'm going to rate Klitschko as an A++ win. So Joshua gets 8 points. Now Joshua is initially set to face Kubrat Pulev, but close to the fight Pulev pulls out due to an injury and Carlos Takam steps in. For a late replacement, Carlos Takam did put on a decent effort, but he would ultimately get stopped later in the fight. Carlos Takam has never really had any standout wins, whether it's versus Joseph Parker, Derek Chisora, Mike Perez. He's always competitive, but I can't say he's a world level fighter without actually having a world level win on his record, so I'm going to put him one step lower in the B tier. Then Joshua finally unifies versus Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker became champion after beating Andy Ruiz for the vacant WBO title by close decision, before that beating Carlos Takam and Alexander Dimitrenko. Defended that title twice versus Razvan Kojanu and Hughie Fury, before ultimately facing Joshua and losing by decision. He did lose to Dillian Whyte but came back, had a bit of a resurgence, beat Derek Chisora twice, lost to Joe Joyce but then had another resurgence, beating Deontay Wilder, Zhilei Zhang and Martin Bakole. Parker has always been a respectable opponent to have, whether at championship or world level. A resume of Takam, Ruiz, Wilder and Zhang is a very good resume. And because of that, despite the losses, I do think he is beyond a simple world level opponent, and I am going to give Joseph Parker an A tier ranking. Joshua would then defend all 3 titles versus Alexander Povetkin. Povetkin had been in title contention for a long time. The only loss on his record is a 12-round stinker versus Vladimir Klitschko. Before the Klitschko fight, he beat Ruslan Chagayev, Marco Huck, Hasim Rahman. After the Klitschko fight, he goes on a really good streak, knocking out Mahmoud Shah, Carlos Takam, Mike Perez, Mariusz Wach, Johan de Huapas. And before facing Joshua, he'd beaten Christian Hammer by decision and knocked out David Price. So despite never being champion, Povetkin did have a resume that was similar to a champion's. There is a conversation to be had about age. Povetkin showed no real signs of slowing down before the Joshua fight. It was after the Joshua fight that he really slowed down, as it became noticeable versus Hughie Fury and Michael Hunter. Povetkin did also give Joshua himself some real trouble. So I think that was the last time we really saw an in-form Povetkin. And an in-form Povetkin is a really good fighter, so I'm going to put him in the A tier. Then Joshua ultimately takes the first loss of his professional career in a massive upset versus Andy Ruiz Jr. It wasn't a massive upset because Ruiz was rubbish. It's more to do with the form of Anthony Joshua by this point. Despite Tyson Fury being the lineal heavyweight champion, Joshua was the #1 heavyweight in the world by this point, considering the work he's done outside the Klitschko fight. Andy Ruiz was best known at this point for his single loss to Joseph Parker by decision. A very close fight that could have gone either way. There's not much on his resume outside of that, but it was impressive the way he was dispatching of those opponents. He was clearly a talented boxer with fast hands despite the gut. As we know, Joshua would get put down in the 3rd round and then dropped 3 more times on his way to a 7th round knockout. They had an immediate rematch 6 months later, and Joshua would poke him to a 12-round decision. To give Ruiz a score, I think his talent is quite undersold, but that is the fault of Ruiz himself, because he was never disciplined enough to reach his full potential. I think if we take his resume for what it is outside the Joshua win, we're looking at a debatable loss to Joseph Parker, a win over Kevin Johnson, Alexander Dimitrenko, after the Joshua fight Chris Arreola and Luis Ortiz, both of which being fights where he doesn't look particularly good. I think despite being unified champion, I'm going to put Ruiz in the B+ tier. When Ruiz is at his best, he is good, but I don't think we saw the best Ruiz versus Joshua in the rematch. Then Joshua defends his titles for the first time since losing them versus Kubrat Pulev. Kubrat Pulev had been around a similarly long time to Alexander Povetkin. He also had a single loss to Vladimir Klitschko, where he got sparks out cold. He was on a good run prior to the Klitschko fight in his prime. Dimitrenko, Ustinov, Tony Thompson. After the Klitschko loss, he got a pretty clear win over Derek Chisora. Also beat Samuel Peter, Hughie Fury, Rydal Booker, Bogdan Dinu. It's not a championship level run of opponents, but I do think beating Chisora by itself does show where you are. Pulev was top 10 for a long time, including during this fight. For that reason, I'm going to put him in the B+ tier. Then Joshua defends his titles versus unified cruiserweight champion Oleksandr Usyk. Loses quite clearly by decision, has a better effort the second time, but loses again. I don't think I need to explain why Usyk would have been an S-tier opponent if he was to win. Then Joshua takes his comeback fight versus Jermaine Franklin, linking up with his new trainer Derek James. It was maybe the most boring fight of Joshua's career. An uneventful 12-round decision. Jermaine Franklin at this point was best known for losing a really close decision to Dillian Whyte. But then again, giving Dillian Whyte a close fight in 2022 isn't quite as impressive as it was a few years ago. Outside of that, there's a few C-tier opponents on his record like Jerry Forrest, Rydell Booker. He actually very recently got an upset win over Ivan Ditchko, although I actually don't think he should have won that fight. Jermaine Franklin, I think, is the quintessential, almost world-level opponent, so he is going to go in the B tier. Now, Joshua is originally set to have a rematch versus Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte fails a drug test the week of the fight, so on a few days' notice, Robert Helenius steps in. Not only was this a short-notice fight, Robert Helenius had fought quite literally a week away from the Joshua fight. It took place in Finland and he won the fight, so he was at home, he was celebrating for a few days. Then Helenius is actually going to go in the D tier. Then Joshua switches trainers again and faces Otto Wallin. Wallin was best known for his fight versus Tyson Fury, giving Fury a massive cut over the eye, but Fury overall winning the fight quite clearly. Wallin then does get a really good win over Murat Gassiev, stopping Gassiev's attempts in the heavyweight division. However, it is difficult to measure Gassiev as a win at heavyweight. Joshua then looks himself for the first time in a while, beats up on Wallin, looks better than ever with his new trainer Ben Davison, and after a good 5 rounds of bullying, Wallin quits and pulls out in the corner. Now, if I was to rate Otto Wallin at this point, I would have said B+. I normally don't like judging opponents based on fights they have afterwards, but to see Wallin lose versus such a slow, sluggish, old version of Derek Chisora, I find it difficult to confidently say he's a world-level opponent. So unfortunately, Otto Wallin is going from a B+ to a B tier win. Then Joshua takes a fight with former UFC champion Francis Ngannou. This win is really difficult to measure. I feel like if the Tyson Fury fight never happened, and Ngannou's first boxing match was versus Joshua, we wouldn't hold the win in any esteem whatsoever, because him getting knocked out was expected to happen. But because Ngannou dropped and almost beat Tyson Fury, it changes things. Before the Usyk fight, that was Tyson Fury's hardest fight, which is weird to say because he did beat Wladimir Klitschko and Deontay Wilder 3 times. Anyway, as we know, Joshua would knock him out inside 2 rounds. Complete demolition job. Now the question is, where do we rank Francis Ngannou as an 0-2 boxer? I didn't even give Conor McGregor a score for Floyd Mayweather. But let's say Conor McGregor fought Keith Thurman before facing Floyd, drops Thurman in the 3rd round and goes to a close decision. The conversation would immediately shift and you have to give points for the win. But the question is how much? I think C tier may be a bit too low because a regional fighter wouldn't give Tyson Fury that much trouble, even if it wasn't out of shape Tyson Fury. Fury was similarly in bad form for the Derek Chisora trilogy, but that fight was very easy for him, so there is some credit you can give to Ngannou for that fight. But to say Ngannou is a world level or championship level fighter is a bit too high. At the end of the day, he doesn't have a win in boxing. So I think to find a balance, I'm going to put him in the B tier as an almost world level win. Because I can imagine Francis Ngannou beating up a lot of out of shape heavyweights, like Dillian Whyte on the form he's on now. I think Makhmudov versus Ngannou would be a very close fight. That would be the last time we see Joshua win a fight up to this point, because his next fight would be versus Daniel Dubois, where he essentially gets bullied for 5 rounds, before eventually finding that big punch at the end and getting put down in the process. And as we know, Joshua is now set to face Jake Paul. But where do we rank Jake Paul as a win is the question. I think I can confidently say Jake Paul as a cruiserweight win would be a C tier win. As of now, as a cruiserweight boxer, he is regional level at this point, but he does not have a fight yet that resembles world level opposition. The tricky thing is though, Jake Paul is not a heavyweight. He's had one fight at heavyweight versus Mike Tyson, but he looks quite fat in that fight, quite out of shape. His cardio wasn't very good. I don't think he's even a C tier opponent as a heavyweight. So when Joshua does beat Jake Paul, which he will, I don't think I'll give him any points. And now to ultimately look at the criteria. Obviously no S+ or S tier fighters for Joshua, 1 A++ tier win in Klitschko, no A+ tier wins, 3 A tier wins White, Parker and Povetkin, 2 B+ tier wins Ruiz and Pulev, a few B level wins Martin, Takam, Wallin, Franklin and Ngannou, a few C tier wins Bashtov, Johnson, Cornish, Brazil and Molina. The Robert Helenius win was downgraded to 0 points because of the short notice situation. He's got 3 losses, Ruiz being a B+ opponent, Usyk being an S tier opponent, and Dubois being an A tier opponent. And that ultimately gives Joshua a score of 41. To have a look at his achievements, he's won 9 world title fights, 3 world titles, 4 champions defeated, and 3 of those champions were champions during the fight. So what you've all been waiting for is where does Joshua rank on the leaderboard? As of now, he's in third last place. He's above Wilder and above Tank Davis, but below Lomachenko. You may notice Tank has gone down a bit from 44 to 38. That's because when I originally did the counting, I scored it wrong. I scored Lamont Roach as a win by mistake, which gave him 6 points, so he goes down 6 points and below Joshua. Overall, for a heavyweight, Joshua does have a very good resume. It may not appear that way because he is at the bottom, but when you consider the guys above him and what they've done, it takes a lot to even be above the score of 50. So anyway, Joshua gets a score of 41, and that does it for the video. Like and subscribe, leave a comment. Goodbye.